The grand ballroom was a shimmering universe of its own, a cavernous space where light seemed to be captured and multiplied 1,000 times over by the countless crystals of the chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling. The air itself hummed with a low, steady rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmurs of hundreds of conversations weaving together into a single elegant noise. It was the kind of party that felt like a dream, a place where the air smelled of expensive perfume and sweet champagne, and everyone was dressed in their most beautiful armor of silk and tailored suits. For Margaret, however, it felt less like a dream and more like a very pretty cage. She stood near a towering ice sculpture that was slowly melting, feeling just as out of place and temporary. Her simple blue dress, which she had thought was so lovely in her bedroom mirror, now seemed to blend into the wallpaper, invisible amongst the sea of designer gowns. Her heart was a heavy, aching stone in her chest, and her eyes, a soft shade of warm brown, were not looking at the glittering scene before her. They were pinned, with a sad and unbreakable focus, on a single point across the room. There, standing near a fountain that bubbled with real champagne, was Tom. And next to him, her arm linked possessively through his, was a woman with a brilliant, laughing smile directed up at him. Tom was smiling back, a smile Margaret remembered, and it felt like a tiny, sharp dagger twisting in her heart. It had only been a month since he had told her, with a careless shrug, that she was just too much, and not enough, all at the same time. Seeing him now, looking so utterly unaffected, so completely happy, made the floor beneath her feet feel unsteady. A hot wave of embarrassment and hurt washed over her, staining her cheeks a faint pink. She couldn't just stand here and watch. She couldn't let him see her standing alone, forgotten. A desperate, wild idea began to form in her mind, a plan born not from cleverness, but from pure, raw emotion. She needed him to look at her. She needed him to feel a fraction of the hurt she was feeling. She needed to make him jealous. Her gaze, frantic and searching, swept across the crowded room, past laughing groups and dancing couples, until it landed on a man standing completely alone on a small, quiet balcony that overlooked the party. He was half in shadow, but even from a distance she could see he was different. He wasn't trying to talk to anyone. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was simply observing, a still and quiet mountain in the middle of a rushing river. He stood with a natural confidence, one hand in the pocket of a suit that looked like it had been painted onto his broad shoulders. He was handsome, with strong features and dark hair, but it was the air of calm power around him that drew her in. He was safe, she thought. A stranger. A handsome stranger who could be the perfect solution to her painful problem. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did very little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Margaret began to walk. It felt like crossing a vast, endless desert. Each step in her uncomfortable heels echoed in her ears. The loud music and laughter seemed to fade into a dull roar as she focused on him, her target. What was she doing? This was insane. She was about to ask a complete stranger to kiss her. Her palms were damp with sweat, and she nervously wiped them on her dress. As she got closer, stepping out of the bright ballroom and into the softer shadows of the balcony, she could see him more clearly. His eyes were a deep, thoughtful green, and they were now fixed on her, watching her approach with a calm, unreadable expression. He didn't look annoyed or welcoming. He simply looked curious. Now standing directly in front of him, Margaret's courage almost failed her. Her mouth felt dry as sand. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, he was so tall. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant music. He didn't say anything, just raised a single, dark eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. The words tumbled out of her in a rushed, desperate plea. "Can you kiss me?" she begged, her eyes wide and pleading. "I want to make him jealous." She gestured weakly back towards the ballroom, towards where Tom was standing. She held her breath, her whole body trembling with a mixture of fear and wild hope. She expected him to laugh. She expected him to coldly turn her away. She did not expect what happened next. A slow, subtle smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a mocking smile or a cruel one. It was a smile of genuine, intrigued amusement. His green eyes sparkled as they looked down at her, taking in her flushed, worried face, her trembling lips. He had been bored out of his mind at this party, tired of the same old people wanting the same old things from him: investments, favors, attention. This was new. This was different. This was a beautiful, flustered woman asking for something no one had ever been brave or foolish enough to ask for before. He saw the genuine pain in her eyes, the desperation behind the bold request. He found he didn't want to say no. "A kiss is a very big deal," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that she felt deep in her bones. It was a voice used to being listened to. He paused, letting his words hang in the air between them. Margaret's heart sank, thinking he was refusing. But then he leaned in just a little closer, and the air around them seemed to crackle with a new electric energy. "But for you," he continued softly, "I'll do it." He didn't give her time to rethink or panic. He moved with a smooth, certain grace. One strong hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin in a gesture that was surprisingly soothing. His other hand found the small of her back, pulling her firmly against him. Margaret gasped softly, her hands coming up to rest weakly on his chest. She could feel the hard, solid muscle beneath the fine fabric of his suit, could feel the surprising warmth of his body. And then he lowered his head. His lips met hers, and every single thought of Tom, of the party, of her embarrassment, vanished from her mind. It was not a quick, fake peck. It was a soft, searching, and incredibly sweet kiss. His lips were warm and firm, moving over hers with a gentle pressure that promised so much more. It was a kiss that asked a question and gave an answer all at once. A faint, clean scent of his cologne, like sandalwood and fresh rain, wrapped around her. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, and her body, which had been tense with anxiety, slowly melted against his. Her fingers curled into his lapel, holding on as her knees felt dangerously weak. The noise of the party disappeared, replaced by the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears and the soft, quiet sound of their breathing. The kiss felt like it lasted both a single second and an entire lifetime. It felt, to her utter astonishment, more real and more right than any kiss she had ever shared before. When he finally pulled away, it was slowly, reluctantly. He released her back, but his hand stayed on her cheek for a moment longer, his thumb giving one last gentle stroke. Margaret stood there, dazed, her lips still tingling, her mind a complete blank. She blinked her eyes open, looking up at the mysterious stranger who had just turned her world upside down with a single pretend kiss. He was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mix of curiosity, satisfaction, and something warmer, something deeper. The plan had worked. She had completely forgotten why she had asked for the kiss in the first place. All she knew was the man standing in front of her. The world rushed back in a dizzying wave of sound and light, the music from the ballroom suddenly seeming too loud, the lights too bright. Margaret stood frozen, her body still humming from the shock of the kiss, her lips tingling with a warmth that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. For a few breathtaking seconds, the entire universe had shrunk to the space occupied by the two of them, to the feeling of his hand on her back and his mouth on hers. Now, reality was reasserting itself with a clumsy, jarring force. Her first coherent thought was a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic. What had she just done? She had kissed a complete stranger, a man whose name she didn't even know, and worse, she had enjoyed it in a way that made her feel flustered and deeply confused. Her cheeks, already warm, flushed a hotter, deeper shade of scarlet. She needed to escape. She needed to find a quiet corner to dissect the strange, swirling emotions tumbling inside her chest. "Thank you," she stammered, the words sounding absurd and inadequate as they left her still tingling lips. She took a wobbly step backward, away from his unsettling presence, away from the intoxicating scent of sandalwood that clung to him. Her plan had been a success, a fact confirmed by a fleeting glimpse over his shoulder where she saw Tom staring at them, his mouth slightly agape, his face a satisfying mask of stunned irritation. But the victory felt hollow, completely overshadowed by the lingering physical memory of the stranger's kiss. She turned to flee, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the balcony's stone floor. "Wait." The single word stopped her as effectively as a physical barrier. It wasn't a command, not quite, but it was spoken with a quiet authority that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. It was a voice that was used to being obeyed. Margaret froze, her back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly, reluctantly, turned to face him again. He hadn't moved from his spot, a pillar of calm amidst her internal storm, but his green eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel utterly transparent. "You can't just drop a bomb like that and run away," he said, that same faint, amused smile playing on his lips again. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance she had tried to create. "It's not very polite to use a man as a weapon and then leave him on the battlefield without so much as a name." His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes were serious, searching. Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. "Margaret," she whispered. "My name is Margaret." "Margaret," he repeated, and the way he said it, letting the name roll slowly off his tongue, made it sound like something beautiful and rare. "I'm Henry." He extended his hand, not for a handshake, but as a gentleman would to lead a lady. Come on. Let's get away from all these prying eyes. I think you owe me at least 5 minutes of conversation for services rendered. Before she could protest or form a coherent thought, her hand was in his. His grip was firm, his skin warm against hers, and a fresh jolt of awareness shot up her arm. He didn't pull her back into the roaring chaos of the main ballroom. Instead, he led her through a different, almost hidden archway that opened onto a secluded, enclosed garden terrace. It was a world apart. The air was cooler here, scented with night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The frantic music was muted to a soft, rhythmic pulse, and the only light came from delicate lanterns strung overhead, casting a golden, intimate glow. He guided her to a small wrought-iron bench nestled between two large potted ferns, a private little nook shielded from the rest of the party. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Margaret stared at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, too aware of his large, solid presence beside her. She could still feel the ghost of his lips on hers, a persistent, thrilling brand. "So," Henry began, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "The him you wanted to make jealous. Who was he?" The question was gentle, without judgment. And so, the whole sad story came tumbling out. She told him about Tom, about their relationship that had fizzled out not with a bang but with a whimper of disinterest from his side. She confessed the sting of seeing him at the party tonight, looking so content with someone new, and the impulsive, desperate idea that had propelled her towards the most compelling man she could find. She told him things she hadn't even admitted to her closest friends, the deep-seated insecurities that Tom had awakened in her. Through it all, Henry just listened, his gaze never leaving her face, his expression thoughtful. When she finally finished, feeling emotionally raw and a little foolish for her confession, he didn't offer empty pity or trite advice. Instead he surprised her. "He's a fool," Henry stated simply, with a finality that left no room for argument. "Any man who could let you walk away for any reason is a complete and utter fool." The conviction in his voice was so absolute, so genuine, that it sent a warm shiver down Margaret's spine. No one had ever spoken about her with such certainty. The conversation then drifted effortlessly, away from the painful past and into the present. He asked her about her life, her work as a graphic designer, her love for old movies and terrible pizza. And he, in turn, told her about himself. He spoke of his work in business, a term he used so vaguely she assumed he was some kind of mid-level executive or manager. He talked about his love for sailing, the feeling of freedom out on the open water, and his frustration at being trapped in stuffy parties like this one. He was witty and sharp, and he made her laugh, a real, genuine laugh that bubbled up from her chest and made her forget her earlier embarrassment. The more they talked, the more the initial electric charge between them settled into a warm, humming connection. The space on the bench between them seemed to shrink, their bodies angled naturally toward one another. After what felt like both a minute and an hour, Henry glanced at his watch, a sleek, expensive-looking thing that gleamed in the lantern light. "I'm afraid I have to go. An early meeting I can't escape," he said, a note of genuine regret in his voice. He stood and offered his hand again to help her up. His fingers lingered around hers for a moment longer than necessary. "But I'd like to see you again, Margaret. Without the audience. Without the emission." Margaret's heart did a complete, joyful somersault in her chest. "I'd like that," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He pulled a simple, elegant pen from his inside pocket, but instead of a business card he took her hand, turning her palm upward. His touch was deliberate, his fingers warm against her sensitive skin. Slowly, carefully he wrote a series of digits on her palm. The sensation of the pen tip moving across her skin was intensely intimate, a slow, deliberate caress that made her breath catch. Each number felt like a secret being whispered onto her flesh. He capped the pen but didn't immediately release her hand, his thumb stroking lightly over the inked numbers. "Call me," he said, his green eyes holding hers, full of a quiet promise. Then, with a final, small smile, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the archway, leaving her alone in the jasmine-scented darkness. Margaret stood there for a long time, her fist closed tightly around the phone number on her palm, as if holding onto a precious secret. The memory of Tom was now a distant, faded picture. Her entire world had been recalibrated, recentered around a single lingering kiss and a phone number written on her skin. The party, the people, the noise, it all meant nothing. All that mattered was the promise of a tomorrow that included Henry. The week that followed was a blur of a new and wonderful kind of normal, a world painted in colors Margaret had forgotten existed. The nervous excitement of their first official date, a simple walk through the sun-dappled paths of the city's botanical gardens, slowly melted into the easy comfort of a second, and then a third. They were not extravagant, grand affairs, these dates. They were quiet, intentional discoveries. They shared messy hamburgers at a tiny, noisy diner, their laughter mingling with the clatter of plates. They spent a rainy afternoon tucked away in the musty, peaceful silence of a used bookstore, pointing out funny titles to each other in whispered voices. They walked for hours, just talking, the city unfolding around them as a backdrop to their growing connection. With every hour spent together, the carefully constructed walls around Margaret's heart crumbled a little more. Henry was not what she had expected. The man she had first seen as a distant, powerful statue on a balcony was, in the soft light of day, incredibly real. He was quick to laugh, a rich, warm sound that made her feel like she had accomplished something wonderful. He listened to her stories about difficult clients and her dreams of starting her own small design studio with a focus that made her feel like she was the most important person in his world. He was sharp and clever, challenging her opinions in a way that was exciting, not argumentative. He never spoke down to her, and he never, ever mentioned his wealth. He was just Henry. And she was falling, completely and helplessly, for him. The physical space between them, once a careful, polite distance, began to dissolve naturally, inevitably. A casual brush of his hand against hers as they walked sent a jolt of awareness straight to her core. A goodnight hug at her doorstep lasted a few seconds longer each time, his strong arms holding her close, the solid warmth of his chest a comforting and thrilling anchor. And then there were the kisses. They started as soft, tender goodnights, sweet echoes of that first, shocking kiss on the balcony. But soon they deepened, intensified by the real feelings blooming between them. One evening, standing under the dim yellow glow of the street lamp outside her apartment building, he had pulled her close, his hand cradling the back of her neck. The kiss had started soft, but then his lips had parted, and the world had narrowed to the feeling of his mouth moving against hers, slow and searching and deeply possessive. It was a kiss that was no longer about a pretense or a polite goodbye. It was a kiss full of wanting, a silent conversation of desire and affection that left her breathless and clinging to his shoulders, her entire body humming with a sweet, aching tension. When he finally pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting together. "Margaret," he had whispered, his voice rough with an emotion that made her heart soar. It was in these moments, lost in the heat of his embrace, that she felt the most cherished, the most seen. Yet, woven through the golden threads of her happiness was a single, persistent strand of guilt. It would surface in the quiet moments when she was alone in her apartment, the memory of his kisses still warm on her lips. She had begun this with a lie, a manipulation. She had used him as a tool for her own bruised ego, and he had been nothing but kind, genuine, and wonderful. The secret of her initial motivation felt like a heavy stone in her stomach, a betrayal of the trust he was so freely giving her. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that she had to tell him. She couldn't build something real on a foundation of half-truths. She chose a quiet park by the lake for her confession. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, and the world was peaceful. They were sitting on a blanket, his arm draped comfortably around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The perfect, serene moment felt like the right time to shatter her own peace. "Henry," she began, her voice small and hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you. About the night we met." She felt the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his arm around her, but he didn't speak, just let her find the words. She told him everything, more than she had that first night. She confessed not just the act of wanting to make Tom jealous, but the depth of her hurt, the pathetic nature of her plan, and the overwhelming guilt that had been eating at her ever since she realized her feelings for him were real. "I started everything with a lie," she finished, a single tear escaping and tracing a warm path down her cheek. "And you've been nothing but honest and good to me. I'm so sorry." She braced herself for his anger, for his withdrawal, for the cold disappointment that would surely shatter her heart. Instead, his hand came up, his thumb gently wiping away her tear. He turned her face towards his green eyes soft and understanding. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Look at me." She met his gaze, her vision blurry with tears. "That night you asked me for the one thing no one ever has. You saw me, not my money, not my name. You saw just a man. It was the most honest request I've received in years." He took a deep breath as if steeling himself. "And now, it's my turn to be honest with you." He paused, his gaze intense. "When I said I was in business, it was an understatement. A big one. My full name is Henry Winslow. My family, We own Winslow Global. Margaret stared at him, her mind scrambling to process the name. Winslow Global. It was a name she saw on skyscrapers, on the news, a colossal, multifaceted empire. A billionaire. The man who held her hand in diners and kissed her in the rain was a billionaire. The air left her lungs in a soft whoosh. You're a billionaire?" she whispered, the word feeling foreign and absurd on her tongue. He nodded, watching her reaction carefully, a flicker of worry in his eyes. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to fall for the man, not the myth. I wanted this," he gestured between them, "to be real." And in that moment, looking at the anxious hope in his eyes, Margaret understood. Her secret, her initial lie, was a small human mistake born from pain. His secret, his wealth, was a fortress he lived inside, a barrier that kept the world at bay. He had let her inside his walls, just as she had let him inside hers. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on her heart simply dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming wave of love and understanding. She didn't care about the money. She cared about the man who had hidden it to protect what they had. Reaching up, she cupped his face in her hands, her tears now tears of relief and joy. "Henry," she said, her voice firm and clear, "I don't care about any of that. I fell in love with you. Just you." The words hung in the twilight air, a final, beautiful truth. His eyes widened, then softened, filling with a light that outshone the dying sun. He pulled her into a kiss, and this one was different from all the others. It was a kiss of relief, of profound gratitude, of a love that was now completely, unquestionably real, with no more secrets standing in its way. The weeks that followed their mutual confession were, for Margaret, a golden age of pure, unshadowed happiness. The knowledge that there were no more secrets between them acted like a key, unlocking a new, deeper level of intimacy. Henry, no longer hiding the largest part of his life, began to share more of his world with her, not with a flashy display of wealth, but in quiet, meaningful ways. He showed her his favorite hidden art gallery, a small, private place that felt more like a personal library for masterpieces than a public museum. He took her sailing on a crisp, windy afternoon, his face alight with a boyish joy as he taught her how to trim the sails, his strong arms guiding hers, his laughter carried away by the salt spray. They cooked dinner together in his spacious, modern kitchen, a comfortable dance of chopping and stirring that felt more like a home than any five-star restaurant. Their love, now built on a foundation of complete honesty, felt unshakable, a fortress that could withstand any storm. It was on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening that the storm arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the sharp, unpleasant sound of a familiar voice. They were at a small, intimate Italian restaurant, a place Henry had chosen for its fantastic food and its policy of giving patrons privacy. They were sharing a dessert, a rich tiramisu, their fingers intertwined on the tablecloth, lost in a quiet conversation about their upcoming weekend plans. The air was warm and smelled of garlic and baking bread. Margaret felt a deep, contented peace, her world perfectly contained within the glow of the candlelight that flickered between them. The peace was shattered in an instant. Well, look what the cat dragged in." The voice was slick with a false, mocking cheer, and it was a voice Margaret would have recognized anywhere. Her head snapped up, her blood running cold. Tom stood beside their table, his hands shoved in his pockets, a smug, unpleasant smile plastered on his face. He looked from Margaret to Henry, his eyes narrowing with a gleam of malicious understanding. "Tom," Margaret said, her voice tight, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing, Maggie," he said, using the old nickname she had always hated. His gaze slid over Henry, taking in his understated but impeccably tailored suit. "I heard a rumor. A big one. I didn't want to believe it, but seeing is believing, I guess." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for their table. "So it's true. You left me for a bigger bank account. I always knew you were a gold digger deep down. I just never thought you'd be so obvious about it." The word gold digger hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Margaret felt as if she had been physically slapped. Her face drained of all color, and she opened her mouth to protest, to scream, but no sound came out. The old insecurities he had nurtured in her came rushing back in a suffocating wave, paralyzing her. But Henry was already moving. He stood up, and the motion was so fluid and yet so filled with contained power that it immediately commanded the space around them. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He seemed to grow taller, his shoulders squaring, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, formidable authority. The gentle, loving man from moments before was gone, replaced by the billionaire CEO who was used to commanding boardrooms and dismantling opponents with a look. First, Henry's voice cut through the tension, low and lethally calm, each word measured and precise. "You will not call her that. Not now, not ever again." His green eyes were like chips of ice, fixed on Tom with an intensity that made the other man take an involuntary step back. "Second," Henry continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a dangerous rumble. "She didn't leave you for me. You lost her long before I ever met her. You lost her because you were too blind and too foolish to see the incredible woman standing right in front of you. You let her go because you were incapable of understanding her worth." He placed a protective hand on Margaret's shoulder, the touch firm and steadying. She could feel the strength radiating from him, a solid rock in her swirling sea of humiliation and anger. "And third," Henry said, his final point delivered with a quiet, devastating finality. "She had no idea who I was or what I was worth when she fell in love with me. You think this is about money?" He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You are so small you can't even conceive of something real. She loved me when she thought I was just a man. That is something you will never, ever understand." Tom stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. All his smug confidence had evaporated under Henry's blistering, truthful assault. He had come to cause a scene, to humiliate Margaret, but he had instead been utterly and completely dismantled. He had no retort, no comeback. The truth of Henry's words was a weapon against which he had no defense. "Now," Henry said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you are going to turn around, walk out of this restaurant, and you are never going to approach Margaret again. Do you understand me?" Defeated and stripped of his pride, Tom could only glare, his face a mottled red. With a last, hateful glance at Margaret, he turned and slunk away, disappearing into the dimness of the restaurant's entrance. The moment he was gone, the fierce energy seemed to drain from Henry. He turned back to Margaret, his expression instantly softening, the ice in his eyes melting into pools of warm concern. He knelt beside her chair, taking both of her cold, shaking hands in his. "Margaret," he whispered, "look at me. Are you all right?" Tears finally welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or hurt. They were tears of overwhelming relief and a love so fierce it stole her breath. He had not just defended her, he had championed her. He had seen the deepest insecurity Tom had planted in her and had torn it out by the roots, publicly and without mercy. He had stood as her shield and her sword, all in one. She looked down at him, at this powerful, incredible man on his knees for her, and her heart swelled until she thought it would burst. "He called me a gold digger," she whispered, her voice trembling. A slow, confident smile touched Henry's lips. "He's wrong," he said, his voice absolute. "You, Margaret, are the only person I've ever met who looked at my world and saw me. You're not a gold digger. You're a treasure hunter who found the one thing I thought I'd never have." He leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "And I will never let anyone make you feel anything less than the amazing woman you are." In that moment, surrounded by the lingering tension of the confrontation, Margaret knew with a certainty that went beyond bone deep. Their love wasn't just a feeling. It was a force. It had been tested in public fire, and it had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, brighter, and more unshakable than ever before. A full year bloomed and matured, a tapestry woven with the golden threads of shared days and the deep, velvet threads of intimate nights. The memory of the confrontation with Tom had long since faded, a distant, insignificant shadow that only served to make the light of their love seem brighter. Henry and Margaret had built a life, a beautiful, solid thing constructed not on the foundation of his wealth, but on the bedrock of mutual respect, unwavering trust, and a passion that had only deepened with time. They had traveled the world, not as a billionaire and his companion, but as two explorers, getting lost in foreign markets and laughing over failed attempts to speak the local language. They had spent lazy Sundays in bed, tangled in sheets and each other, the outside world held at bay by the simple magic of being together. Margaret's design studio had flourished, her confidence growing under Henry's steadfast belief in her, a belief that never crossed the line into interference, only offering support when she asked. He was her partner in every sense of the word. On the evening of their one-year anniversary of meeting on that fateful balcony, Henry suggested a walk. The night was clear and warm, the sky a deep indigo blanket pricked with 1,000 silver stars. He was unusually quiet, his hand holding hers a little tighter than normal, a subtle, thrilling energy humming just beneath his calm exterior. He led her not toward their usual path by the river, but through the elegant, quiet streets toward the very hotel that had hosted the party where their story began. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, a smile playing on her lips, suspecting a fancy anniversary dinner. "A little nostalgia," was all Henry said, his voice a soft rumble in the twilight. When they arrived, the grand building was just as magnificent as she remembered, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a place of pilgrimage. Instead of entering through the bustling main doors, Henry led her around the side, to a small, private elevator operated by a staff member who nodded respectfully and said nothing. The elevator ascended smoothly, silently, opening directly onto the very balcony where their lives had collided. Margaret gasped. It had been transformed. The vast, empty space was now an intimate, open-air sanctuary. Dozens of pillar candles and glass hurricanes flickered warmly, casting dancing shadows on the stone floor. Delicate white roses, her favorite, were arranged in artful clusters, their sweet perfume scenting the air. Soft, romantic music drifted from hidden speakers, a melody that seemed to be woven from the very starlight above. Below them, the city glittered like a spilled treasure chest, but up here on their private island in the sky, it was only a backdrop to the scene he had created. "Henry," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. It's beautiful." He led her to the center of the balcony, to the exact spot where she had once stood, desperate and heartbroken, and begged a stranger for a kiss. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. The candlelight danced in his deep green eyes, which were now fixed on hers with an intensity that made her heart begin to beat a wild, hopeful rhythm. "Margaret," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you remember what you asked me right here 1 year ago tonight?" She nodded, unable to speak, the memory washing over her not with shame, but with a profound sense of destiny. "You asked me for one kiss," he continued, his thumb stroking the backs of her hands. "One kiss to make someone else jealous. You were trying to fix a broken heart." He paused, his gaze holding hers captive. "That kiss, it was the beginning of everything for me. It was the moment I stopped being just a man standing alone and started becoming the man who was meant to stand with you." He released one of her hands and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to one knee. Margaret's breath hitched, her free hand flying to her mouth as she watched him pull a small velvet box from his pocket. The world seemed to hold its breath. "You asked me for one kiss to make someone else jealous," he repeated, his voice strong and clear now, filled with all the love and promise of their year together. He opened the box. Nestled inside was a breathtaking diamond, not overly large but exquisitely cut, catching the candlelight and fracturing it into 1,000 brilliant rainbows. It was elegant and unique, just like her. "Now I'm asking you for 1,000,000 more. I'm asking you for every good morning kiss for the rest of our lives. I'm asking for every kiss when you're happy and every kiss when you're sad. I'm asking for the kiss that will seal our vows, and the kisses we'll share when we're old and gray." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Margaret's face, but she was smiling, a radiant, boundless smile that came from the very core of her soul. "Margaret," Henry said, his own eyes shimmering. "My love. My forever. Will you marry me?" The word burst from her, loud and clear and filled with more happiness than she knew a single heart could hold. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, Henry. 1,000,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of a promise that was meant to last a lifetime. He rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms, and he kissed her. It was not like their first kiss, which had been a shocking, pretend spark. It was not like any of the passionate kisses they had shared since. This kiss was a vow. It was deep and slow and soul-searing, a silent communication of forever, of devotion, of a love that had begun as a desperate fiction and had been forged, through truth and trials, into an unbreakable reality. It was the first kiss of their forever. When they finally parted, foreheads resting together, both breathing heavily, wrapped in the glow of their new promise, Henry smiled down at her, his eyes full of a mischievous, loving light. "Our story started with a single, crazy question," he whispered. "And now it's just beginning. If you were swept away by Henry and Margaret's journey from a pretend kiss to a forever promise, there are so many more love stories waiting to be discovered. To find your next favorite tale of romance, destiny, and heart-stopping moments, be sure to subscribe. New stories of love and adventure begin all the time, and you won't want to miss a single one.